I love the story of the lady who lived by herself, and one day she noticed that she had a new neighbour moving in, and she took out her binoculars and peered round the edge of the net curtains, and he pulled up in his Mercedes and was carrying out all this expensive equipment and furniture, and she thought, I rather like the look of him. And zooming in with her binoculars, she found that there was no wedding ring on his finger. So before you could say Jack Robinson, she had made a tray of tea and she went out to meet him and welcome him as a new neighbour. So he very gladly received the tea, and he looked at her and he said, is everything all right? Noticing the way that she was looking at him, and she said, yes, it's just that you look like my fourth husband. He said, oh, how many times have you been married? 3, she said. I'm not suggesting that we all follow her example, but when an opportunity comes along, are we prepared? Do you, like me, sometimes leave things to the last minute? Well, there are some things we can get away with leaving to the last minute, and other preparations that need to be made. During 1940, during the Battle of Britain, the RAF quickly learnt the need to be prepared for enemy attacks. The alternative was to see heavy losses. Any planes still on the ground were sitting ducks. Preparation meant having all the planes, all the pilots, always ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Radar gave us an early warning, but even then you may only have 10 minutes of notice. So the pilots needed to be within yards of their planes, ready to take off and climb into the sky so that they were safe from any incoming planes. The RAF knew what it meant to be prepared, and they knew the cost of failure. Jesus wants us to be prepared and to know the cost of failure. And so when talking of his return, his second coming, what we call the parousia, the final judgment, the last days, he tells this story of the wise and foolish bridesmaids. Now, to us, it's a strange story because it's dealing with customs with which we're not familiar. But those who heard Jesus tell the story knew exactly what he was saying. At a Jewish wedding, the bridegroom would begin by going to the bride's home, where the wedding ceremony would be held. Then the bride and groom would process back to his place for the start of the festivities, picking up guests along the way. And in the parable, we're told that the bridesmaids, who were part of the guests to be picked up along the way, were waiting to join that procession. It seems that there was always some uncertainty as to when the procession would be, uncertainty enough that they were all armed with lamps, and some of them even with extra oil for their lamps. When the procession arrived at midnight, only those with enough oil could join the celebration, and the others who had to get more turned out to be excluded. Jesus was describing an incident which everybody could understand. They could see how easily that could happen. And the point was that just as those bridesmaids who were prepared could go to the celebration, so Christians who are prepared may go to the heavenly feast, prepared for those who follow. You may remember that Jesus says in Matthew 8:11, "Many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." He's now explaining that the only way to be prepared, the only people who will enter that are those who are prepared to take their places at the feast. So what does it mean to be prepared? How can we make sure that we are prepared? It means believing in who Jesus is. He said, I am the Son of God, I am the Messiah. We need to believe that. It means knowing that you are acceptable to God, not through what you do or what you don't do, but through faith. It means knowing that God's Holy Spirit is at work in you and through you, fitting you for heaven, enabling you to serve Christ as a disciple. It means increasingly seeing the world through God's eyes. And part of that means recognizing injustice. And that's where we have our link with the reading from Amos. Imagine a wealthy nation where the economy is in good shape, and yet the gap between the rich and poor is getting bigger and bigger. It could be Britain. Imagine those in executive positions being granted enormous bonuses if they succeed, or being given enormous handshakes if they fail, whilst employees lower down the chain are regularly sacrificed in order to give dividends to the shareholders and make the short-term results look good. Power tends to corrupt. Now, I'm old enough, and I know many of you are old enough to remember Terry Wogan on Radio 2 in the mornings, and I used to enjoy listening to him. And one day, he was playing the song Starship, which has the chorus, "Nothing's going to stop us now. Nothing's going to stop us now. Nothing's going to stop us now." And his voice broke in, and he said, "I wouldn't be too sure about that." And the song went on, "Nothing's going to stop us," and he cut them off. And then there was an evil chuckle, and he said, "Power corrupts." And it's a trivial example, but it does. Power corrupts. And the more we have, the more easily we can justify the idea that we deserve it. And the more we're tempted to look upon the have-nots as losers, or in some way people who don't deserve what we have. And that's exactly what happened to the Israelites in Amos's time. The wealthy had become corrupted by their own power and had thereby caused suffering among the losers who they saw in their own society. And it was that angered God. How could that happen in a society that was centered upon God and his commands? Well, that was the point. They were clearly not still centered upon God and his commands. They were centered upon selfish gain, and what religion there was had become nothing more than shallow ritual. The nation's heart was not with God. Otherwise, they would have seen the world as God sees it and would have been appalled at the inequalities and the suffering that they were causing their brothers and sisters. And this is why in our reading from Amos, God denounces the shallow worship of the people when he says, "Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." In 1963, Martin Luther King, the American Baptist preacher and civil rights activist, gave his most famous and visionary speech with that often repeated refrain, "I have a dream." In that speech, he said that black Americans could never be content as long as they could not vote in the south of the country. "Nor will we be satisfied," he continued, "until justice rolls on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream." In 2008, following the announcement that the United States had voted in their first black president in Barack Obama, one commentator said that they felt Martin Luther King's dream had at last come true. Sadly, we've been reminded this week by the scandal that's enveloped Yorkshire County Cricket Club how far we still have to go when it comes to overcoming racism. We've also been reminded this last week by the Owen Paterson fallout and the second job questions among MPs, how far we have to go when it comes to overcoming corruption in high places. Our prayer is that those in authority, in government, in business, in education, healthcare, and the justice system will not be satisfied until justice rolls on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. But back to us, because justice, like love, begins at home. How do we share out our family income? How do we balance what we spend on luxuries, like holidays and cars, and what we give to God and what we give to those in need and what we give to charities? How do we decide what we spend our money on in terms of the effect that has on the planet, its carbon footprint and everything else? How do we support campaigns that right wrongs, right down to our idea of justice in who has the remote control when the telly is on? We saw earlier that the point of the parable of the wise and the foolish bridesmaids was that we must be prepared to meet Christ, either at his return or when we die. What Jesus is saying is that only those who will be prepared will take their place at the feast. Amos makes it clear that the mere performance of religious rituals will not ensure that a person is prepared. Rather, true holiness is evidenced by all that we do to maintain justice and to fight injustice. Or as Micah puts it slightly differently, what does God require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. A friend of mine is an RAF chaplain, and I remember him telling me how it felt for him to conduct the funerals of 14 victims of the Nimrod crash in Afghanistan in 2006. For him and for all the members of the armed forces, there are constant reminders of our mortality, of the fact that we are not necessarily going to be here for our 70 years or whatever it is. We too easily put to the back of our minds this idea of being prepared. Other things so easily take priority. But our readings this morning ask us a simple question. Are you prepared? As we think about that, let's sing our next hymn, Beauty for Brokenness. And just think about these words as we sing together.